The beginning of Book 4 of Ben-Hur, the chapter Ben-Hur Returns East, which is the first one that you were meant to read, puts us and puts Ben-Hur in the situation that I described at the end of the last video. His galley slave years are behind him, but so are his years as the actively adopted son of Quintus Arrius. He now has the wealth and freedom to come back east, to come to Antioch, then in Syria, today I believe in Turkey, not far north of Jerusalem, to find his mother and sister. When he calls on Simonides, his father's old servant, because of his father's wealth, the servant feels that that is what Ben-Hur is after. However, what Ben-Hur cares about more than anything is finding out what has become of his loved ones. The description at the beginning, it's saying it's the year of our Lord 29. So again, you see what Wallace is doing with the time period here. We're just a very short time away from Jesus' public ministry and his crucifixion. Ben-Hur is said as being well-dressed, speaking Latin, which was the language of the Roman Empire, perfectly. He seems to be a cultured and privileged young Roman man. Of course, he is a Jew. And the important thing underlying everything in this reading and your next one, everything in Book 4, if not the entire novel, is Ben-Hur's awareness of his Jewish identity, his awareness of the promises made to his race, what the prophets of the Old Testament said, the coming Messiah, and how he connects that to what he actually sees. And remember I said that he sees Jesus face to face. He's already met him, of course, without knowing who he was. What he sees when that Messiah and the person of Jesus Christ really comes to the world. I think this was the question that most interested Lew Wallace. He was saying to the readers, in my opinion, he was saying, put yourself in that world in that time. What would it be like to not be someone from today, as some of us may wish we could do, and go back knowing all about Jesus, knowing what has happened since, knowing the truth of who he is? What would it mean to someone of that time to hear about this preacher, to hear about what he said and did, and then to see him? That's the real motif or basic idea behind Ben-Hur. The reason I don't think it's really a realistic story is that this is essentially a romantic idea. Yes, this is a historical novel. Yes, Lew Wallace researched it very thoroughly. Frank Norris, a realist writer, felt that very complete research and knowing the material behind the fiction you wrote was very important. One could argue that it is. At the same time, this is a long ago and far off place, except in our faith, except in God touching us within ourselves every day. And so it teeters between realism and romanticism. Simonides, it is strongly implied in this first chapter, and also in the chapter where Ben-Hur meets him, resisted this torture, bore the torture, until Gratus was finally tired of doing it and let him out, apparently, because he was so loyal to his master, because he simply would not give up the money, the wealth that Ben-Hur's father left. It's rather a coincidence, the sort of coincidence that happens in fiction, as Judah speaks to the man on the boat and is told his own story. The prince's only son tried to kill the procurator Gratus. The name of his master was Ben-Hur, Prince of Jerusalem. The boy was sent to the galleys, and so on. Situational irony. The character, of course, doesn't know he's speaking to the person who has experienced this. But Ben-Hur goes to Simonides' house, and he figures that this is his chance to find out what has happened to his mother and sister. The strength that Simonides shows, and he is a very powerful character, sitting up in this chair, propped up. He can hardly move because his bones were broken, or whatever we want to imagine, is something like that, of course, that Ben-Hur showed himself so dramatically in the galleys.
What service have you seen? 41.
A month's less a day in this ship.
You keep an exact account. And before?
3 years in other ships.
3 years. You have the spirit to fight back, but the good sense to control it. Your eyes are full of hate, 41. That's good. Hate keeps a man alive.
Ben-Hur stays alive throughout these years because of hate, but that's only half the story. Certainly he holds hatred for the Romans and for Messala and is hoping for revenge. But he would be an unpleasant character and not the hero of this novel if that were all that he had to him. He also has love of his mother and sister and the desire to help them and be with them again. Simonides basically bears his suffering only for love of his master and of the family that his master has left. He also loves his daughter Esther, and he, although the chapter is not in your reading, he tells the story of how much he loved Esther's mother, so much that he remained a slave when he could have been freed because she was a slave, so that he could marry her. A few paragraphs before, all it says is, "A girl well forward into womanhood." And that Ben-Hur greets the girl not even by name. This is Esther, named appropriately after the beautiful queen of the Old Testament by her father, loved tremendously by her father now that his master and his wife are both gone, and a very important character in the novel. In fact, Wallace makes it pretty obvious whenever a young man who is unattached is the hero of a novel, and he meets a nice and lovely girl, something is going to happen here. Then, after Esther introduces herself and Simonides talks of his loves, one of which is clearly her, and one of which is the family of the House of Hur, he demands proofs of Ben-Hur's identity. Ben-Hur could not possibly have had those proofs, his household having been broken up, himself sent to the galleys, etc. Instead, he tells Simonides his own story, which takes up much of page 333. We don't need to spend much time on it except to point out the line near the bottom of the first column, "May a Jew forget his religion or his birthplace, if it were the holy land of our fathers." Wallace constantly stressing Ben-Hur's Jewish ethnicity and loyalty, that he would not give it up however good Arius had been to him. Ben-Hur then says, "I can't give you proof, so I am not asking for any wealth. I am not asking for you to be my slave." He asks at the bottom of 334 only of his mother and Tirzah, "What can you tell me of them?" Simonides says he has no idea, and then Ben-Hur goes to a place called the Grove of Daphne, and we pick up our story there. The chapter called The Mulberries of Daphne is a brief one, at least the excerpt that's in our book, but it's very important. Ben-Hur has run into Malach. He's run into a fellow Hebrew in a garden which is completely devoted to the pagan world of the Romans, to the gods and goddesses. Moloch is actually someone who has been sent by Simonides to spy on Ben-Hur. In a later chapter, which is in the reading in our book, but which I haven't assigned you, Simonides questions Moloch. He asks him about Ben-Hur. Did you see him spend a lot of money? Did you see him eat or drink? The impression I get is eat to excess, drink to drunkenness. What kind of young man is he? Is he worthy? This is the basic point, really, of his father's wealth and of his father's name. But in this chapter called The Mulberries of Daphne, and Daphne being one of the many immortals, goddesses, nymphs, etc., that the Romans worshipped, Ben-Hur goes through this beautiful place. It says on page 338, the right column, the charm of the grove seemed plain to him. In charge of the flowers and shrubs and watching the growth, could he forget the days of his troubled life? This conflict is central to his character. He is tempted by giving in completely to what Rome represents, including that pagan religion. He's tempted by the ease of his present life and by the beautiful ease of everything that is around him, the kind that somebody like Masala was perfectly happy to take advantage of from his privileged position. But when Wallace says by and by his Jewish nature began to stir within him, to Wallace, Jewish never means the cliches, the details of prejudice, which are common in, for example, The Merchant of Venice and the viewpoint a lot of Europeans have had of Jews for hundreds of years. He's talking about his religion and his belief in law. For example, when the ship had sunk and Arius asked his former galley slave Ben-Hur to kill him, to save him from possible capture and disgrace, Ben-Hur said one of the commandments is thou shalt not kill, so I won't do it. So his Jewish nature in this case means the God that his father, a Sadducee, we'll say more about that later, raised him to believe in. And so it means that he thought, yes, love is delightful, but then he calls out, God of Israel, the God of Moses, the God of the Old Testament, Mother, Tirzah, his sister, cursed be the moment in which I yield myself happy in your loss. What he's saying is, I am never going to let myself be happy, and maybe he's overdoing it here, but I'm never going to let myself be satisfied, even for a moment, as long as I have not found or rescued, if I can, my mother and sister. The other issue here is love versus law, a very basic one and very important in understanding the Bible as an entire book. The last sentence of the chapter is key. The law of the place was love, but love without law. What does this mean? God is a God of complete justice, and sometimes, as in Jonathan Edwards' sermon, of stern justice, of what appears to be unyielding justice. Jesus says in the Gospels that he has come to fulfill it. He has said that every jot and tittle of the law, to use the Greek vocabulary, will be fulfilled. God has never canceled the law, and we live under God's law, and we must follow it. Then we have love, which is the balance against that, because he is also a loving God. This paradox is at the center of who he is. That is a paradox beyond our understanding, really, just like the Trinity is one beyond our understanding, how God can be three persons and yet absolutely unified. God is not the merely judging, threatening God that I think the Muslims and Jews still basically believe in. Nor is he the mushy, loving God who doesn't require anything that I think the Hindus and Buddhists and unfortunately a lot of Christians believe in also. He is both at the same time. But you cannot have one without the other. Love without law is meaningless. It means there are no rules. It means that our personal desires are are the only thing that matters. Of course, that's nonsense. Anyone raising more than one child knows that. People's personal desires clash against each other, and you have chaos unless you have some kind of rules. But law without love is what the Pharisees are. It's cold. It's judgmental. It requires us to do something that we cannot do. It would leave us, in Edward's great image, just slipping down the hill, completely unable to stop ourselves, borne down by the weight of our own sins. And so what Lew Wallace puts so well here is that Ben-Hur realizes it can't be all one or all the other. However, he's been a little too focused on law. He's been a little too focused on the firmer, harsher side of life. Not surprising. He's suffered a lot. Those of us who've seen the galley slave scene in the movie know that. And he will suffer even more when finding out what's become of his mother and sister. But Ben-Hur still has things to learn, and he is going to learn them by the end of the novel. And he's going to learn them from the best source of all, from Jesus.